It's early morning in a farmstead outside Trondheim. It's 890 AD, and a woman is about to do something more dangerous than almost anything her husband will ever do with a sword in his hand. There is no hospital. There is no anesthesia. There is no sterile instrument of any kind, because germ theory won't exist for another 1,000 years. There is no doctor coming. There is a midwife, a knife that's been passed through fire, and whatever herbs happen to be hanging from the rafters. And she is about to give birth in a wooden house, on a straw-covered floor, with a real, calculated chance that she does not walk out of this room alive. Here's the number that should stop you. In the Viking Age, a woman's odds of dying from causes related to childbirth over her lifetime were somewhere in the range of 1 in 50, possibly worse. Compare that to a Viking man's odds of dying in actual combat. Most men never fought in a real battle at all in their entire lives. Statistically, in this world, giving birth was more dangerous than being a warrior. And yet, and this is the part that gets buried under 1,000 years of Vikings are just raiders mythology, the Norse didn't treat childbirth as something to be quietly survived in a back room. They built an entire structure of medicine, ritual, law, and belief around it. A woman who died in childbirth wasn't pitied. She was, in a specific and documented way, treated like a warrior who died in battle. So today, we're going through what actually happened in that room. The midwife, the herbs, the pain, the risk, the gods who were supposedly watching, and what happened afterward if it went wrong. And by the end, you're going to understand something that reframes the entire idea of what strength meant in Norse society, and why Viking women had legal rights that wouldn't exist again in most of Europe for another 800 years. Let's go. Here's the misconception. Pop culture Vikings are almost entirely men with axes. Women, when they appear at all, are in the background, waiting at home, occasionally shown as a shield maiden for dramatic effect, but mostly absent from the actual story. That's backwards, and it's backwards specifically because of childbirth. In a society running on a knife's edge of population, where every farm needed labor, every raid needed men, and infant mortality was already brutal before you even factor in maternal risk, a woman's ability to survive childbirth repeatedly, and the value that gave her, translated directly into real social and legal power. Norse law codes, recorded a little later but reflecting older custom, gave women the right to divorce, to inherit property, to run a farm alone while their husband was away, raiding or trading, and to demand compensation if they were mistreated. That's not an accident sitting next to childbirth risk. It's a direct result of it. To understand why, we need to go into the room itself. There was no hospital because there was no such concept. Birth happened at home, almost always on the floor rather than in a bed, often with straw laid down specifically to be burned afterward, along with anything else soaked through in the process. That detail alone tells you the Norse understood, even without germ theory, that something about the mess of birth needed to be destroyed rather than reused. The knife used to cut the birth cord was, in many documented traditions across early medieval Northern Europe, deliberately passed through fire first. They didn't have a word for sterilization, but they had clearly noticed, generation after generation, that fire-treated blades led to fewer deaths than untreated ones. Practical knowledge arrived at the hard way, through repetition and loss, exactly the same way the Egyptians figured out which wind catcher angle actually cooled a house. Pain relief, by modern standards, was almost nothing. Herbal preparations included things like mugwort and other locally available plants believed to ease labor or speed delivery, some of which had genuine mild effects and many of which almost certainly didn't, mixed in with substances used more for their believed spiritual protection than any measurable pharmacological one. There was no anesthesia in any real sense. A woman in Viking Age labor was, for the most part, working through the entire process on nothing but whatever effect a handful of herbs and a warm hearth fire could provide, and whatever nerve she had left by hour 12. Here's where the system actually gets sophisticated. Birth wasn't handled alone, and it wasn't handled by whoever happened to be nearby. It was handled by a specific, recognized role, a wifer setukona, roughly the woman who sits over. An experienced woman, often one who had survived multiple births herself, who accumulated practical obstetric knowledge across an entire community and was called specifically because of it. This wasn't informal. A skilled midwife in Norse society carried real social weight, comparable in some ways to a skilled healer or a respected craftsperson, someone whose accumulated experience directly determined whether a household's next generation survived. She would have handled everything from turning a poorly positioned baby by hand to recognizing when labor was going dangerously wrong, to managing the practical aftermath, bleeding, the delivery of the afterbirth, and the first critical hours of a newborn's life in a climate that could kill an unprotected infant in under an hour. And she operated with essentially no modern safety net, no blood transfusion if hemorrhaging started, no surgical intervention if the baby was positioned wrong in a way hands alone couldn't fix. Her skill, built entirely from watching other births and doing this over and over across years, was the only technology standing between a normal labor and a fatal one. Here's the part that tells you how seriously the Norse took this risk. They didn't leave it to medicine alone. They built religious infrastructure specifically around it. Frigg, Odin's wife, and one of the most powerful figures in the Norse pantheon, was directly associated with childbirth, motherhood, and foreknowledge of fate, and she wasn't alone. The Disir, a group of female ancestral or protective spirits, were specifically invoked for fertility and safe delivery, and archaeological finds include small amulets believed to have been worn or placed near a laboring woman specifically for protection. Charms and spoken formulas, some later recorded in medical and magical manuscripts across Scandinavia, were used during difficult labors, invoking these figures by name to ease the birth or turn a breech baby. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you the Norse weren't separating medicine and religion the way we do. Calling on Frigg during a hard labor wasn't superstition layered on top of real help. In their framework, it was part of the help, running alongside the midwife's physical skill, not instead of it. When your actual medical toolkit has real limits, you use everything available, and belief was, functionally, part of the toolkit. Now the hard part, because it went wrong often enough that Norse society built an entire cultural response to it. Maternal mortality in this period, across pre-modern societies generally, not uniquely Norse, is estimated in ranges that would be almost incomprehensible to a modern maternity ward. Complications from hemorrhage, infection following a difficult birth, or a baby positioned in a way that no amount of midwife skill could resolve, could and did kill women in their prime, repeatedly, generation after generation. This wasn't a rare tragedy. It was a routine, expected risk that every pregnant woman and everyone around her understood going in. And here is the detail that changes how you should think about all of it. A woman who died in childbirth was, in Norse belief, treated with a specific and elevated status in death. The most striking version of this is the belief, recorded in Old Norse sources, that women who died in childbirth could be received into Folkvanger, the afterlife field belonging to the goddess Freya, the same destination associated with slain warriors, alongside, and in some readings, in direct parallel to, Valhalla, Odin's hall reserved for those who died gloriously in battle. Read that again. The Norse afterlife system, the same one built to reward and immortalize warriors who died fighting, had a lane for women who died in labor. That is not a small detail. That is a civilization explicitly telling itself, generation after generation, that dying in childbirth was not a private tragedy. It was a death with honor attached, comparable to dying with a sword in your hand. Now flip it around. If you survived, and most women did, most of the time, especially with a skilled midwife and a bit of luck, what did that actually get you in Norse society? Quite a lot, by the standards of the medieval world around it. Norse women, uniquely for the period, could own land in their own name, initiate divorce, and keep their dowry if the marriage ended badly, and run a farm's entire operation, livestock, trade decisions, hired labor, while husbands were away raiding or trading for months at a time, sometimes for years. Grave goods found in high-status female Viking burials include weighing scales, keys, a specific symbol of household authority, and, in a small but real number of cases, weapons, suggesting a level of standing and responsibility that doesn't line up with the passive background wife image most people carry around. None of this happened in a vacuum. A society this dependent on women surviving repeated childbirth to keep its population and labor force intact had a direct, practical incentive to grant real authority and protection to the women who did the surviving. It's not romantic, it's closer to structural necessity, but the result was still a set of legal rights that most of medieval Christian Europe would not offer women again for the better part of a millennium. All right, here's where this turns over. We opened by comparing a woman's odds in childbirth to a man's odds in battle, and the honest comparison actually favors reframing it further. A Viking woman who gave birth several times across her life was, statistically, taking on cumulative mortal risk that could rival or exceed what most Viking men ever faced in actual combat. Because, and this surprises people, most Norse men never fought in a real battle at all. Raiding was seasonal, selective, and many men in a given community spent their entire lives farming, fishing, and trading without ever swinging a weapon at another human being in anger. Which means the demographic actually taking on the most repeated, near-certain mortal risk in Viking society, generation after generation, wasn't the raiders we put on TV posters. It was the women having their second, third, and fourth children in a wooden house with a midwife and a fire-warmed knife. The Norse, to their credit, seem to have understood this on some level, hence Frigg, hence Folkvanger, hence property rights that wouldn't reappear in most of Europe for centuries. The warrior with the axe was never the only version of courage this culture recognized. It just became the only version we remembered. Here's what I keep coming back to. There is a woman in a farmhouse outside Trondheim, on a straw floor, in more pain than most of us will ever experience, with a midwife's hands as her only real technology and a whispered charm to Frigg as her only anesthesia. She does not know, in that moment, whether she is having a normal Tuesday or the worst night of her life, and neither does anyone else in the room. If she survives, and the odds, more often than not, are with her, she goes back to running a farm, raising the child, and holding legal rights that a woman in most of Christian Europe will not have for another 800 years. If she doesn't, her community does not quietly bury her as an unfortunate loss. They send her, by their own belief, to the same field reserved for warriors who died with honor. We don't build afterlives for anything anymore, so we don't have an equivalent ritual. But it's worth noticing that the culture we picture as the most violence-obsessed in medieval history built one of its highest honors around a kind of survival that had nothing to do with a sword. So, knowing what you know now, does Viking warrior still mean what you thought it meant an hour ago? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.